right. Welcome to Shoot the Dancing Bear. It's a pop culture conversation bringing a critical perspective to what we're calling sort of collective narratives through a philosophical, literary, and psychological lens. We're your hosts, Jesse Roa, Tim Malone, and me, Gabe Garcia. Just a quick note, be sure to check out the notes for this podcast for links and additional information. We're going to include those for all the sort of myriad citations that we make and mention during the discussion. Okay. With that, let's jump right in. I think today the first topic that we sort of discussed prior to this bringing up was sort of the idea of sort of whose voices are represented in this podcast, and what problems are sort of like embedded within that, and sort of making just a little bit of qualification for those listening to sort of orient themselves to the conversation.
And this is a conversation that began last week that we didn't really get to explore, and it's a conversation I think that we'll return to over and over. We might not exhaust all of our thoughts or all the critical issues around representation, but I think it's important to address it and then to open up some of our thoughts about the contemporary moment in politics, in particular identity politics versus a more structural or class-based analysis, and the way all that plays out in an analysis of pop culture.
Mm-hmm. Right, so this is a natural segue from sort of where we left things off in a lot of ways last week, right?
Absolutely.
So this is going to be us being able to state our thoughts on whether we think it's okay, first of all, or the appropriateness of us being able to speak on people of a different creed, people of a different sex, ethnicity, whatever. Are we able to elucidate our own thoughts and do so in such a way while we still recognize that this is essentially a podcast run by three white dudes, right? So can we go ahead and represent the myriad perspectives, and can we also maintain a space for ourselves to present our ideas, right?
And to what degree can we incorporate self-criticality? So we're critical of our own ideas, but there will always be a blind side there. There's always we're always subject to critique, in particular from this kind of from a variety of different ways, from a feminist analysis, from a racial analysis, from whatever that analysis is. There's going to be certain things we just don't see.
Right. Mm-hmm. Right. And but I sort of wanted to arrive at the potential thought that we're going to have some courage in our ideas and realize that we're going to say some things that maybe might. I don't think we're setting out to offend anybody or do anything like that at all. But what we are going to say are specifically thoughts that we have that we feel are very concrete. And a lot of times when you operate in a space where we do intellectually, there's going to be significant disagreement with what you have to say. And we're going to have to be able to engage with a lot of ideas here. And some of those are going to be presented by people that maybe are not in the same space as us, right? And we would hope to be able to be judged by the quality of the ideas, including if we come up with some really shitty ideas, right? Mm-hmm. Then we should be judged based on that. Hopefully we can go ahead and get to a space where that's acceptable, right?
Right.
And I don't know, I was thinking of this in particular because there had been an article that came out last week, and I know neither of you guys are really big on sports, but there was an article written by a writer from the Chicago Sun-Times, I believe it was. It was a sports article named Michael Wilbon. And he had written an article which was based around the idea of analytics in sports, the move towards a numerical-based assessment of athletes, right? So we're going to take a rational, almost scientific approach to what we see happening with the athletes. We're going to judge them and how good they are based on numbers and stuff like that, right? And he wrote an article which was essentially why African Americans aren't down with analytics, right? Which to me was problematic, but also coming from a place where you can understand where something like this would be written, because on the one hand, it is another space to exclude African Americans from a position that's traditionally been white, right? Mm-hmm. So where we have a bunch of white dudes come in, all right, look, now we're going to run the team the way we want it. We want people who understand numbers, and so this is going to be another excuse to hire white dudes from Harvard, really good colleges or whatever. But yeah, things like that. Mm-hmm. But on the other end of the spectrum, you've also kind of basically written an article implying that black people aren't into math which is a little regressive, right?
Right.
So where I'm sort of getting at it is we need to be able to critique ideas regardless of where they're coming from. And so this is the kind of thing I'm talking about. And we're going to have to accept, look, we're white people coming at something like that. I'm obviously feeling like that's a pretty stupid article, but it is what's been produced, and it did come from a place where maybe the intention was more about inclusion, even if the necessary thesis, which is that, you know, black people aren't really into analytics or whatever, is kind of like a wrong-headed assessment.
Racist.
Right? Yeah, racist kind of. But written by an African American.
Right.
So these are the things that we want to be able to, and that's a sports example, but it was the one that struck me this week, and it was sort of the example I could think of to come in on it.
Right, and I just want to kind of segue over to Gabe, because what I'm thinking in particular about was Gabe bringing up last week this idea, look, we're going to get shitted on. People are going to have problems with a lot of the stuff we're saying. And one particular issue is, you know, we were critiquing Debbie Wasserman Schultz.
I think it got cut.
And so the question that came up out of that was, okay, so we don't necessarily, because of our bodies, because of how we're situated, our identities, does one, as for instance, as me, as a white male, have the capacity to critique Debbie Wasserman Schultz, right? And so I kind of want to throw this back to you, Gabe, and kind of like to state your position, and then so that then I can respond to it, or Jesse can respond to it. But I wanted to kind of like refresh what it is that was the concern about when we were talking about this guy.
I think we should, before you get into it, I think we should clear this up, that if anybody's listening to this who, you know, listened to the first podcast, this was something that was cut from the first podcast, so this wasn't on there. But.
Yeah, this is essentially something that happened within the Democratic Party during, you know, regarding Bernie Sanders and Clinton, and we were, you know, kind of critiquing how it was handled. And, you know, my concern there, at least wanting to bring in, you know, sort of like a, you know, what, so the question sort of was like, do we have license to sort of bring, you know, to speak from, say, a feminist perspective? And sort of what I was arriving at is sort of like, we're trying to bring in as many voices as we possibly can to these conversations, but that doesn't give us license to be any kind of professional, any kind of like, you know, perfect voice about it.
Right.
And you know, I think the purpose in my mind, in terms of how we're orienting ourselves in these discussions, is to create better questions within the context of pop culture, wider dominant culture. And so that we can generate conversations happening, and we're just a small part of that. We're just, you know, hopefully catalyzing some good questions that might, you know, create real world change, or, you know, bigger political discussions, or activism or something. I mean, we see ourselves in sort of a link in the chain, so to speak, but qualifying all nonetheless that we are who we are. We're oriented to these conversations due to the culture that we were brought up in a sense. Yeah. So I don't really know what the answer to that is, but where I've arrived sort of is that, you know, we're sort of postulating we want to generate conversation. We don't want to limit conversation.
Yeah. Absolutely. And specifically what I'm thinking about is what I'm thinking about, the kind of like proper answer to some of this stuff is, because I come from this Marxist position which requires a class analysis, so one must be able to critique across the spectrum of identities, regardless of identity, from a particular essential position, which is, you know, in Marxist language, class struggle, right? So you've got to be able to analyze the way the economy is influencing this stuff, or what. So if Debbie Wasserman Schultz is making an argument about something, or affecting particular policies which serve particular interests, I've got to be able to talk about that because I'm interested in dismantling that structure of authority. Regardless of whether she's a woman or not. What I'm worried about, though, where I think the identity politic analysis becomes in handy, how do I do so? Do I do so by then saying Debbie Wasserman Schultz is a fucking bitch? because then I'm incorporating misogynistic patriarchal
Right.
language instead of saying, here's my problem with Debbie Wasserman Schultz, here's the idea that I have a problem with. She's a part of the neoliberal establishment, she's into rolling back the welfare rolls, she's into eliminating, any public good, and she's also really corrupt in her practice about how she's legislating for somebody who has policies I'm against, right? Like in her support for Clinton. But then do I roll misogynistic language in to do that? And so so those things can function simultaneously. And then I need to be careful with my critique not to say, like, because then I do reproduce elements of patriarchy. But I don't think that's necessarily what happened last week, but I do think Gabe was right for bringing it up. But that's where I differ, or not even differ, but where I want to be clear about my position. My position is everything is subject to critique. Be careful about what you bring in sloppiness in the critique, because you can reproduce some of the dynamics which you're politically against.
Yes.
Right? And so I don't. That's all I have to really say about that.
Right, and I think just to clear things up, essentially what had happened was we went into I went into a bit of a spiel on how essentially Debbie Wasserman Schultz was a piece of shit based on my distaste for her payday loan, based on her payday loan stuff, which you can look up if anybody's interested, basically. And I tried my best to avoid using gendered language, but I think, look, if there's any potential possibility that somebody might be offended, maybe it was a good decision to cut it. So
that's not even want to cut it. I think we cut it because we were all getting buzzed and just getting sloppy and talking shit.
That too.
We do drink beers like we're doing now while doing this podcast.
I think, speaking for myself at least, I am really into hip hop, and I really enjoy one of the main things about hip hop is when you see something that you don't like or care for, you don't just sort of accept it, move past it, or whatever. You shit on it, and you make fun of it, or you do whatever, and that's kind of sort of always been my feeling.
And that'll happen in this podcast,
and that's going to happen probably.
But I do think it's a good thing to address, right, for two reasons. One is the very sensitivity that we have, the self kind of disciplining effect, that where you're not using misogynistic language,
right,
but then you're still aware that it could be interpreted that way, right? So one, us needing to be self-aware to not do that. We didn't do that in this particular case. But then and of course the flip side of that phenomena is for our audience. Can your audience hear a critique of Debbie Wasserman Schultz and not reflexively go, that's a dude talking about it, therefore the critique is invalid? Right, and so that's the conversation I think, like Gabe's talking about, that we really want to discuss. Because from my political position, if I can't critique a woman based on her ideas because I have a penis, that is a dead politics. And I don't think that's necessarily done intentionally. I think that's often wrapped up in this kind of like theoretical language, but that's the effect. And I think that that's mistaken politically.
Yeah, it's a little stifling, right?
Yeah.
So, well, did anybody else have anything else to say on that? Or?
I mean, I would just add one more thing, I think, which is just that, we're approaching this, the reason why we're sort of starting this podcast off in this way is to sort of make a qualification and sort of make it known that we sort of are fallible. We're sort of operating on a first draft policy. This is just a conversation that's ongoing and unfolding and happening, and we would hope to include everybody's voice as much as possible in the critique of our own ideas.
Right. And I think that
and go ahead and shit on us in the comment section, and if your critique is good, we might have you on as a guest.
Please do. And please do, and then don't be surprised when somebody named douchebag 2380 comes into the comments and calls you an asshole. That's probably me. So anyway, I think like the fact that we were even willing to discuss this is, I think, at least a good indicator that we're coming from the right place, probably, right? And then, well, since we didn't really intend for this to be much of a huge topic for this particular podcast, at least, I think this is a good time to awkwardly segue into our next topic, which sort of got vaguely referenced last week. And is a fantastic segue from representation, because it's something that does not have much of that, which is to say, we're going to talk about Game of Thrones.
Yes.
So that's where we're coming at next, and I'm kind of excited to go into it because I think we do present a really different analysis of it than you're going to see from a lot of other places. But you're also probably going to get maybe a harsher assessment than you might be ready for or prepared for. So, let's let that be a caveat. And if you want to skip to the next topic, go ahead and pace forward about 35 minutes to an hour.
But don't do that because it's going to be awesome. Our regular corner shitting on Game of Thrones is now in session. So Gabe, so can you kind of introduce the kind of question that we're looking at?
Yeah,
with
sure.
Game of Thrones.
So we've all been watching Game of Thrones.
We're all up to date, I think. Right?
We're all up to date. We've been sort of, there's going to be obviously spoilers, so just keep that in mind if you're going to progress with this. But I think the main, Jesse, you brought this up, and I was really interested in this idea of the Game of Thrones being sort of a symbol of sort of the end of the golden era of TV. And I was wondering if I would love to dish that out to you and just kind of like see if we can get a conversation going about sort of what the golden age of TV is, and why Game of Thrones might be the sort of a marker essentially of the end of that golden age.
Okay, sure. So let's just sort of define our terms a little bit here just to begin with this. And this is an idea that is not unique to me or anything like that. I think that this is something that I've seen in a lot of writing related to the television pop culture happening now, which was that I'd say beginning with The Sopranos and maybe, to my mind, ending with the final episode of Mad Men probably. What we had was sort of described as the golden age of television, which I think has been sort of vaguely defined in a lot of ways, or maybe it has been defined more specifically than I've heard before. But the way I would choose to define it is the moment where television as art became an acceptable medium, right? So we had discussed earlier was the idea that certain types of mediums are more or less acceptable than others. We've already, through the society and through many years of product, accepted that literature and film, we can consider that highbrow. It's worthy of critical discussion or inquiry or whatever. And then we have what I would consider the low shit, which I don't think is low, but which a lot of people would disagree with me about, but which is, your fucking comic books, your video games, your often music, I think still to some extent, existing in this area where it's not necessarily worthy of inquiry. And I think that the golden age of television was the moment where television took the leap from low culture to highbrow, right? And where we're allowed to accept this, and we see it even in the capitalist structure where like legitimate actors are now willing to work in that field as opposed to being like, oh, this is television, that's shit, I'm not working in that, right? So where I'm arriving at things is the idea that Game of Thrones is symbolic of the final death gasp of the golden age of television, where we've progressed from people who were given the freedom to create sort of really interesting, often brilliant works, which to my mind were not even necessarily political in any sense, or but even deeper than that. And this was something that we came to in conversation last week, and when I listened to the podcast over again, I thought it was an interesting idea, where Tim had arrived at the idea that possibly not every pop culture artifact is an expression of capitalism, but actually an expression of a deeper emotional aloneness or solitude, or attempt to fucking get to the inner experience of humanity, which is where I think the real great art exists, not in a political lens, but in this deeper area, which is just the essential question of humanity, right? And I think a lot of the great shows like The Wire, Mad Men, to maybe a lesser extent stuff like True Detective and like Breaking Bad or whatever, were getting at those ideas, questions of morality, ethics, stuff like that. And where I see Game of Thrones as sort of the death knell of that golden age was that Game of Thrones sort of came up alongside a lot of those television shows and deals with the same ideas, but does it really poorly. And I'm going to argue that part of the reason that I would say something like Mad Men, well, probably a lot like very much less entertaining on a populist level to the greater population is a far more important show as an artifact than something like Game of Thrones is. But there is some similarities, especially in the way that they're critiqued. They're both seen as sometimes occasionally misogynistic. They're occasionally seen as sort of dark and depressive about the human condition. I feel like one addresses those concepts in a juvenile way or with a lack of understanding, and one does it with a great level of understanding, and that's sort of where I'd like to go at it. So,
okay, Gabe.
I mean, thinking about assignment of value, you know, like what makes art great, you know, and that's been a point of discussion within all sort of mediums of art since since probably the cave paintings, you know, like that's a good horse you drew or that's a crappy horse, you know.
Yeah.
What makes something good? What makes something nuanced? What makes something, you know, and if we are looking at just that, you know, Game of Thrones is an important show, not necessarily because it's highbrow or nuanced, but because it captures so much of our attention in the same way that Twin Peaks did.
Right.
People couldn't wait for the next episode, you know, and we see that sort of happening with these longer form narratives where you can pursue them for. I mean, part of it is that you don't know when it's going to end. It's not like a film where you have 3 acts or something. Right. You can have 8-10 seasons of something. They can start it, but they don't exactly know where it's going to go at the end. Yeah. So when we're thinking about what captures our imagination about Game of Thrones, I'm sort of like just thinking about like the things that are that draw us to it, because certainly we all watch it, right? So I mean, I often think of like Eros and Thanatos, the Freudian idea of sex and death, and how those things are like intricately intertwined. And not to get too off track, but I think
this is perfectly on track.
Okay, I'm constantly thinking about this idea of in feminist theory, the idea of the male rampage genre, and how they term any sort of Mel Gibson film where the hero is a sort of flawed outsider working in the force of sort of quote unquote good, and opposed to some huge dynamic evil that's on the other side, embodied by some other male nemesis. Right. And that often comes to bear in Game of Thrones.
And they actually just want to fuck each other.
Yeah, and actually just want to. Yeah,
if they just do that and get it over with. You have to lose all these innocent people.
Yeah. And if you think about it, that comes into our language in many ways when sort of men come into fisticuffs. It's like, I got fucked. Yeah. I got fucked in the ass by this guy or whatever. It's like that the idea of sexuality and death are intricately intertwined, and the narrative really. The narrative of Game of Thrones often plays on it to the point where you have young men killing their fathers and stuff, and so it's like if you want to go Freudian, you can really go Freudian with that. What I mean? So I'm thinking about assignment of value, what gives something its importance, and so I'd like to dish that out to you, Tim. Sort of like, what did that spark in you?
Yeah, a couple of different things. One, getting to the kind of like the deep shit. Which I'm going to bracket right now. But I'm thinking specifically in terms of, let's look at how this Golden Age stuff plays with this specific example. I'm talking about not last week's episode, but 2 weeks ago with Hodor and Hold the Door, right? And so this is something that we can really go in on. This was supposed to be this, emotionally traumatic, we talked about Greek tragedy, this tragic thing, and this all played in a particular way. And there was a certain buildup that was built up over time with this. And I mean, for me, a lot of manipulation going on in the writing and in the structure of this. So this is just an event. It's an empty signifier in a lot of ways, just emotional affect for just emotional affect. But I want to open that conversation up a little bit, specifically looking at Hodor and Hold the Door, while simultaneously asking the question, TV's golden age. If this is the death of TV's golden age, I'd say Game of Thrones is the one show in which everyone knows we're supposedly in TV's golden age. Not just the intellectuals, not the people reading the commentary, but your average watcher, your mass audience, right? And I use that in quotes, right? Because I'm critical of those notions. But so the mass audience now believes they're participating in the TV golden age, yet they're not watching Mad Men. They're not watching True Detective. They're not watching The Sopranos. They're not watching some of this stuff, which for me is different just based on quality of content. But they're part of the zeitgeist, golden age of television, yet kind of getting this degraded product, yet still feel somehow incorporated into this this process, while simultaneously there's a degradation in the product. And so I want to think about what that implies for the subjectivity of the audience. But specifically, Hodor, hold the door, emotionally effective, sad. But my basic, I'm basically going to return. I'm going to let Jesse talk about this a little bit, because I've got specific thoughts about kind of the way that this plays in terms of how you treat people of lower classes and how much value they have. I mean, the idea that one human being's function is literally just to hold the door so that the elites can continue their maintenance of fucking authoritarian, brutal, and cruel rule, and that your job as working class is simply to function as a bridge across which they walk as you die, and that is somehow some kind of satisfying life and one that we should cry over, as opposed to some kind of like great crime against Hodor, right? And so that, I know Jesse and I think similarly about this, but so I'm going to pass it to you.
Well, I'm going to actually go back to something Gabe said in a minute, but just to continue on with what you're talking about, at this point, how are we not to either treat the character of, is it Bran or Bran? Bran, right? Yeah. How are we not to just treat that character as a psychic Machiavellian, right? How is he just not an awful villain in the course of this television show at this point? He literally ruined a dude's life, made him mentally handicapped for the entirety of his existence, so that he could come to his one heroic moment, which was to fucking hold a door open. And that's the end of it, right? And I'll be honest with you, I watched it here with you. I thought it was kind of a tacky attempt at wrestling some emotional connection to a character who, quite frankly, I had no emotional connection to. This is a character who shows up, utters the line Hodor, oh, he's cute, whatever. But like, this is the definition of a flat character, right? This is the definition of a character who's there who's a rung on the plot ladder. Yeah. That's all it is. And it was so naked to me. Yeah. I couldn't believe. People reacted strongly to it. People were emotionally affected by it, and I mean, on a certain level, you are affected by it, and I will admit to some sympathy for it, mainly on just a human level, whereas, somebody died.
But the idea is we can be affected by things, but then we need to be able to think critically about them too. Why do I think this? What did they do to me to make me feel emotionally about this? What really happened here?
Right. And essentially, my feeling is that, especially this show in particular, and this is where I wanted to come back to something that I was really struck by when Gabe was talking, which is that sex and death, right? And I thought I made a comparison earlier between this and Mad Men, and I think a lot of people who might listen to this might think to themselves, like, what the hell? That's like apples and oranges, right? But if you're thinking on a deeper level, I'm not talking about the genre of the shows. I'm not talking about like who the actors are or how long it is or any of the superficial stuff. I'm talking on a purely thematic level. What are those shows about? And I think both of those shows are about sex and death, but they did it in very different ways. Whereas in Mad Men, like, think about all those, the opening image of Don Draper falling out the window, or that weird scene for, I forget which season it was, when he waits for the elevator to come up and the door opens and the elevator's not there and he just stares down into a dark elevator shaft. Right. And there's always this pervasive feeling that there's death or foreboding in that show. It was always this very dark potential for death. And then obviously the sex was a key element of that as well. but explained. We see where that comes from. We see the psychology of the character and how that's created, and it often comes from trauma or things like that. We're given reasoning and understanding for why these things exist. Whereas in Game of Thrones, it feels like the machinations of the show are so much more obvious. It's basically, in what way can we find an avenue to shock our audience? At what point, it's become kind of a joke, but you can think of it like as soon as things start going too well for a character, they're probably going to die pretty soon, right? And that's basically what the show has arrived at, where death is a tool to move the plot along to whatever eventuality, and it becomes this it almost in a way much darker, more cynical take on things, because it becomes purely, we're going to keep you hooked because you don't know who's going to die. And it's not that we believe that death has any meaning or anything interesting going on beyond that. It's just that we're going to use this as a way to hook you in, and that hopefully your favorite character lasts till the end of it.
And this is precisely the point I was making of people being hooked into this whole golden age narrative, them coming in and watching TV. And so what's the pedagogical lesson of that, right? Whereas if you're engaged in a show like Mad Men that is asking these kind of deep questions about existential questions about death and sex and how,
and a much more emotional show, like when you would see the moments where, people I think are going to be like, well, you didn't really give any examples of. There's so much going on in Mad Men just related to death. Seeing the ghost of the woman who took care of him when he came back from the war all the time, or like the ghost of Bert Cooper dancing in the office room. And there's so much. The specter of death is always looming over it, right? Don Draper's literally created because another person dies so that he can exist. Right.
Very similar to Arya Stark and her faceless assassin clique. A little parallel there, but this role of anonymity, changing identities. But look at the way that these two things, I think that's a perfect example of kind of the depth of engagement and care for the audience. Around some serious stuff. Like, so Game of Thrones almost grabs certain of these principles and just makes them empty signifiers. Know what's cool? Death and sex and changing identities just for the sake of like consuming like candy.
Right.
Join us next week when now that we know that time travel is a capability in Game of Thrones, to see if Arya Stark is actually Don Draper, the faceless man plunging to his death in the intro.
Just puts on a business suit and starts walking through Game of Thrones and just shanking people. Right. Starts up an advertising firm in the middle of Essos.
Well, I liked what you were saying, Jesse, about this idea of sort of someone being a rung on the sort of narrative ladder or something. Because if you think about who's being represented and how bodies are treated, right? We have Hodor, who sort of dies for this quote-unquote noble cause, and he's someone that's this sort of lovable character. And yet we also, in the same episode, had the Wildling girl, who was also joined Bran on most of his, and now was protecting, I think, the other brother, and comes to the point where she's almost going to kill Ramsay. Yeah. And she uses her, sexual prowess, which has worked in the past, to kind of seduce him, and she's about to murder him. Oh God! And then she just gets shanked, essentially. Yeah. And what's the outcome of that? Nobody was talking about her the next day. Everybody was talking about Hodor. Right. It was the end of the episode. So just thinking about how female bodies are treated versus male bodies are treated, and sex and death.
And I think an interesting thing about that is, in terms of what they've contributed to the show, the female character hasn't been seen in a few seasons, but I would actually argue she was more of a character than Hodor ever was. Absolutely. Right? I remember those first few seasons where she shows up, she's actually got some development, we're given some reason to care about her, and this is kind of an interesting throwback to your initial topic of the podcast, which was representation, and what a poor job this. I'm not the type of person who's I would be very frank. I'm not very interested in identity politics readings of art. I'm not interested in political readings of art. But when it becomes ridiculous, where you refuse to acknowledge that those things are there, then we get Game of Thrones, where we have a show where the only African American character I can remember is the sex pirate, who appears in like 3 episodes, right?
Right.
Or
And the Dothraki, I think, stand in for all black and brown people.
right, and
Which
and
are the horse riding, in quotes, savages.
right, the ethnically ambiguous Dothraki, but savages, right? Who need to be acculturated by a white woman, basically.
Yeah.
So, I mean, when it becomes this ridiculous, the way it has become on the show, I think it's worth addressing.
Yeah, and one thing I want to say in particular, since we're in our shitting on Game of Thrones segment, whereas you aren't as interested in the kind of identity politics and the kind of political, that's my primary focus, not the identity, but the political. And so what I saw in most particular with the Hodor fucking thing was this is just the clearest explication of how this show treats issues of capital and race. What it is the working class or average people are basically foils, ladders, to use your language, upon which...
Also, the show's language.
Right?
Remember the chaos is a ladder thing from like early...
And so what these characters function to do is to further these kind of conflicts between these elite families, these dominant, wealthy, like in occupied language, like the 1%. So literally the whole narrative story becomes about interplay and politics of the 1%. There is a politics in that. And the politics is most clearly manifested in Cersei's walk of shame. Okay? What you have then, what that is class resentment. And how are the classes, who are you, audience? How does this show think about you? What they see you as is a mob of lusting, resentful,
shit-flingers.
Ignorant, shit-flingers. Who would rape if the power wasn't there, who would steal if the power wasn't there, but also willing to legitimize that very structure of rule because you enjoy the spectacle so much. The spectacle, of course, being Game of Thrones. So what I'm saying is, what happens is a normative common sense. How is a normative common sense constructed in popular culture that elitism and hierarchy is necessary? By deep investment with the characters in Game of Thrones, by identification with the characters, right? You identify with the drama between Cersei and Jaime, right? At first, you fucking hate them because they're incest, but then you feel bad for them. Then you hate, and they're fucking with you, and all these. You know who you are? You're the one sitting outside getting all your shit took and getting run over by horses, and then when you get a chance, you're throwing shit. That's the audience. The audience is that mob, and that. So basically, throughout the show, that's how I've felt treated as audience. And in addition, Hodor is just another manifestation of that. What is the lesson of Hodor? It's that the noble good thing is to sacrifice yourself for this great fucking adventure, right? Which is this war of the thrones, and everybody has their role. What's your role? This deep hierarchy. Where is like the actual resistance against that? The best character, as far as that goes, is the goddamn priest, who they're making into a psychotic, by the way. A religious fanatic or whatever. So you've got to wrap up any kind of class-based analysis within a fanaticism.
Within irrationality.
Within a irrationality. And then you can take out two birds with one stone. You can link up a political radicalism with a fanaticism.
Right.
And all is dismissible. And then make that, in the end, they're not going to win. I mean, there might be some great destruction shit, but this is not the hero of the show kind of thing. And so what I'm interested in is the normative common sense, which gets constructed in particular about the necessity of elitism and hierarchy, and the way that the audience is then positioned to identify with these characters, even though they're in the position of being the fucking mob. Right?
Yeah, there was some small meme that about was it the High Septon or whatever his name is?
Yeah.
This is another Bernie Sanders or something, and it was a picture of
he
them
does
side
look
by
very
side.
similar.
Yeah,
Precisely, right.
which I thought was really funny. But one of the most interesting analyses,
similar to Bernie Sanders, he's destined to lose. So.
Yeah, who's not destined to lose in Game of Thrones?
Right.
But I read a really interesting analysis. I'm sorry I can't cite the author, but they were basically making the argument that the Starks were, the largest hand of evil in the show, because the Lannisters actually brought some semblance of order to that whole world. And the Starks were the ones that actually like mobilized a warring class to just cause endless destruction over the North, all for essentially what was a very small reason. Pushed a kid out of a window or whatever.
Right. Well, and this is my point. Right?
Where's your real politics?
And let's take this last episode, which I swear to God was the worst fucking episode of Game of Thrones I've ever seen. And
you didn't like the 20 minutes of the nerdy author self-insert?
Intrigue
at the
fighting against his father and taking his fucking penis, the sword.
Jesus.
But, dude, like, that was the worst episode of Golden Age television I think I've ever seen. Nothing of substance happened. This show is the best I've ever seen at creating build up to events that people are somehow willing to stay invested in. That who gives a shit?
Right.
I mean, who gives a shit? And the add-on characters, and it just fractures like a web. And it's almost like a device in audience expectation and frustration. Like, if that was being done consciously, but I think it's a lot more cynical than that. I think this is much more of a capitalist vehicle than that. But my point is, back to yours, which is with this elitism inherent in the show. Why does Sansa Stark? I understand she's the victim of, like, just disgusting brutality.
Right.
But why is she then entitled to rule a whole section of Westeros? What are her qualifications? What about the other people she's enabled to go ahead and lead wars and take back and conquer whatever? And we all cheer behind that. Right. And I understand the cheering behind that. But if you think about it and just back up for a second in terms of, are there other people there besides the mob? I don't know.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think this is part of what the problem with the show is, and why I think it's the death of the golden age of television, is that we use questions of horror or tragedy, or we use a rape sequence to make a character who many people, I think, didn't really care much for or about in the show. Were there like a group of Sansa fans? Like, I don't think so. Like, she was just like a character who
She was a foil to make Arya cool.
Yeah, she was there to make. She wasn't even really a very interesting character. So the writer's technique is to have this horrific act happen to her, so that then we, as the audience, are going to desire for her to have the revenge. But it's such a transparent move to create empathy on the behalf of the audience that I don't buy it. Like, I don't buy it. I don't like it. I don't get it. And to me, so many of the things that happen in Game of Thrones are these sort of transparent moves to try to elicit your empathy for one side or the other, and that's all it is. It's really transparent movements towards manipulating the audience. And when I think that you have achieved a truly great piece of art is when you don't feel that you're being manipulated into something. You just feel the purest expression of an artist's desire to tell a story. And whether you feel something for the character or not is immaterial to the point. You're going to feel it, right? And I think, like, just to go back to the common comparison I keep making, like, Mad Men was a show where very few people died, very little happens in that show in the way of what we might call like an exciting moment, right? Like, the most exciting moment in that show was when that dude got his toe ran over by a lawnmower in the office, right?
Yeah.
Like, that was the biggest action moment.
Yeah, and almost like ridiculing.
And it was funny, right?
Yeah.
Right?
And but that show, when deaths do occur, at least I was far more affected by any of the death occurring on that, because I felt like that show had something to say about what was happening and what death was, and that feeling, that despair. Like, the numerous scenes in the show of Don Draper breaking down into tears or breaking down in pure emotion over deaths, or and tying this in with capital and how that all comes into play. And it was just such a much richer tapestry than what we have here, which is just here's another death, is another rung on the ladder, and we keep going up, and eventually we'll get to the top and find out what the end result of this. But at that point, who cares, right?
Yeah. And I think that I love the way that this conversation is unfolding, because I'm thinking about if we sort of zoom out, and look at the task of the writers, right? And like, this is I never watched True Blood, for instance, but I had some friends that were really like into that and I remember them making this really like fast switch between seasons, and they were like, this show is now crap. Like, right. they just were not successfully able to integrate. I think it has to do, like, it's like the idea of, back to what I was saying about the idea of you when you have a television show, you sort of mapped out the first episode just to get the pilot made, and then beyond that you have to write the rest of it. And Game of Thrones had several books that it could work off of.
Source material
To work off, right? And but then at some point they're sort of like flying on their own writing, which is essentially what they're doing now, because the books, as I understand it,
they've surpassed. I've read the books; they're well past. They're about a season past the book.
You don't know where you're going to end up. So if you don't know where you're going to end up, whether you're going to be writing one season and then get canceled, or you're going to be writing 8 and having to deal with this stuff for a very long time, you better have your philosophical ducks in order, which Mad Men did.
Right.
Like, Mad Men pivoted, and accordingly, because it was going to keep going on. Game of Thrones is just sort of reached this hyperbolic state of sort of shock value, continuing on with the same tropes that it's been doing for however many seasons it's been on, and the audience really sees through that, as opposed to dealing with it in a different way, a more nuanced way, say that you see in Mad Men.
How do we have a show that has dragons, that has fucking dragons, and 6 seasons in, the dragons have not been in a battle? The only thing, like Jesse said, that the dragons have done is fry a goat. They fried a goat,
fucking up some livestock,
and they keep fucking introducing the dragons, then pulling them back. The dragons are there, we need to put them in prison. The dragons are there, the dragons escape. Now she's back on the dragon again, and giving some fucking rousing, romantic leadership speech, which entirely falls fucking flat, right?
Well, that was
it's
bad.
almost like, is this just if this show is just an exercise in frustrating audience expectations, that'd be brilliant.
Yeah.
Right? But I don't think that's what it is. If they never ever use the dragons, if what happens is all of a sudden the dragons get in a fight and one of them bites the other one, they both fall into the ocean and drown and never get used, then the show's doing something. It's frustrating audience expectations for sensationalism and easy kind of like wrap up. That's not what's going to happen. They don't know what to do with the fucking dragons.
Yeah.
And
they know what to do with the wolves, by the way. They'll just kill them all.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. How do you have shows with fucking wolves? Never get fucking used, right?
Yeah.
And so, in addition, how do you have a show what mechanisms are latching the audience into the show where literally none of the major characters are even in the same fucking continent? Let alone interacting with one another. And so that's what I mean. The show is so good at building up audience expectations. All these traditional capital techniques to lock you into something so you stay long enough.
Yeah,
right?
That's really interesting.
But it's almost like over-conforming to that principle of never giving you the big fucking payoff, which always is kind of flat and empty anyway.
Yeah.
But so it just keeps building, then it'll give you like some subtle shift, and then it'll build, and then you'll jump to some other shit you have some investment in. And then build, and then subtle shift or some subtle resolution, which is never satisfying. You know what I'm saying? It's like, that's what Game of Thrones is fucking with you, right? But I don't think it's doing that in any kind of critical way. I just think it sucks.
It's like moving towards the singularity. The singularity being fire and ice, right? This epic battle that the whole thing's going to just wrap itself up in and become a, what do you call it? When a sun implodes on itself. And
right.
It becomes a fucking dwarf.
It becomes a black hole sucking the golden age of TV into it. And just
remember when TV was good? Sucking everything in.
Yeah.
Oh god. So I mean, obviously we're not like super huge fans of what's happening currently in this show, but I'm going to use this as an opportunity. I don't know if anybody still has anything to say about this. I'm going to use this as an opportunity to segue into the next topic, which is, again, an awkward segue, but
Who cares? Just do it. Just
they're always
break
awkward.
it.
Okay, So Game of Thrones, same episode, we have my man Hodor and his heroic final death, holding a door and then just getting his ass whooped by skeletons.
One thing I did want to say in addition,
Yeah.
I do want to reference this. I don't know what's going on in the culture with these constant references to True Detective style membrane theory, time travel. That time is a flat circle. But that shit is fucking everywhere all the time, and that's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea that you can incorporate that interesting of an idea and have it work that shittily is a real testament to the shittiness of this show.
Well, how is this going to work in the future? If he can just do this, isn't this a problem?
It's the ultimate escape device for the writers. You can literally have Bran just do anything at any time.
Just go back and take over some guy and make him into a mentally handicapped person?
Yeah.
That's what's going to happen?
Yeah.
Right. I did like the idea of kind of psychic overload in the character that is so traumatic and so short. But I've never seen such an effective device be used so fucking poorly at the one fucking time.
I think that's a really interesting point too, in terms of what you see in TV writing, and we're talking about this so-called golden age, and what speaks to us as viewers, and you see a lot this idea of playing with reality, right? It's almost, and to sort of bring in the psychedelic perspective, it's sort of like time is a flat circle or whatever. Yeah. You're seeing that played around with the big overarching question for me, and watching a lot of these shows, is sort of what is reality?
Yeah.
And it's not exactly what we think it is.
Uh-huh.
So how do we play with that within the narrative device? So we have time travel. We have which is not anything new in filmmaking. I mean, they've been doing that all the way back to Greece and media res. You start in the middle and you kind of jump around in time and stuff like that. But it doesn't work as well in Game of Thrones as it does in, say, Mad Men, because it's moving towards a teleological end in Mad Men. There's a reason why you're seeing Don as a kid, or sitting next to himself, and it's interesting to see the juxtapose, older Don with himself as the young child in the same scene or whatever.
Right.
And it works, but it doesn't work for me in the same way as Game of Thrones, because it's not creating the same nuance, the psychedelic nuance that truly happens when you have a psychotic break or you have an LSD trip or something like that.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, it's almost empty signifiers.
Yes.
It's grabbing these things that are out there doing real work in the shows like Mad Men, and then grabbing the surface of those things, and then using them really cynically.
Yes.
That's what Game of Thrones is. And the problem for me is then the audiences think they're getting the real thing. To go back to Mad Men, Coke is the real thing,
Yeah.
It's not. It's fucking this empty marketing fucking campaign. Game of Thrones is a giant marketing campaign for deep television.
Yeah.
For ideas.
Yeah.
Game of Thrones is so deep, it's so crazy, there's so much politics, there's so much this. There's nothing going on in that show. What there is frustration of audience expectations being mistaken for depth and thoughtfulness.
Yeah, in a way, it sort of mimics the sort of the presidential primary in a lot of ways, and just brings up a lot of those same ideas where you're constantly running up against frustrations, and is Clinton going to be indicted by the FBI, and we are all sort of rooting for that, or some of us are rooting for it.
Right.
But it doesn't quite happen, So it's
absolutely. Yeah. So is this a story or not? Do I need to?
Yeah.
Because we all know what the political establishment is, what it is.
Yeah.
It's not going to happen.
And I'm sort of making a sort of a really big leap, but that Game of Thrones is actually sort of a documentary in the same way that sort of you're writing a story about what's happening now, but in a different time period.
Yeah.
This actually, because I was about to segue into the next topic for a
Sorry.
minute. No, but actually, thank you, because this reminded me of something I actually also wanted to talk about, which is that I think that Game of Thrones, and I don't like to make, like I said, I don't like to do necessarily a political reading of things, mainly because my training is in literature, and a lot of the theory that we went through was about the idea that most great literature is great because of existential reasons, right? Which is the deepest shit, the questions of existence, whatever. But when I got what I'm thinking about with Game of Thrones is it's almost impossible to engage with it on that level, because it's not really saying anything of interest, or really. I do feel like it is saying something about politics, regressive in what it's saying essentially, but which is I think something that's sort of showing up in the current landscape of the media, right? where we cover, where the media covers the election as the horse race or a game, right?
Right.
Or is this technique by Trump effective, right?
Yes.
Is it? We question the efficacy of things, but we don't question the morality or ethic of it, even though that's what the media is essentially there to represent, right? Game of Thrones is operating on a similar level, where we have characters and we ask ourselves, are they playing the game right? So now that we see Sansa is being a little more conniving or a little bit more like she's going behind people's backs, she's keeping secrets from Jon Snow or whatever. Oh, now she's playing the game, right? As to imply that the only way to get ahead, essentially, is to exist in the fucking chessboard of politics, where you're selectively doing awful, immoral things, and that's the only way to win, right? That's the only way to get ahead. And I think that posits kind of, as the biggest cynic probably here, I think that posits a real fucked up notion of what we are as humans, to where
Hillary Clinton, or Sansa Stark is young Hillary Clinton, right?
Yeah, I mean, basically, I think that what's happening there is an acceptance of the game, right? Can you accept that you're playing this political game correctly? And if so, then you can win it, maybe. But if you don't, you'll be beheaded, like the dude at the beginning of the first season was named Ned or whatever.
Ned, you can't have morals.
You can't have ethics, essentially. And I think that's a real weird fucking thing to go ahead and present to the public and have them eat up.
But it's justifying of current political arrangements, right?
Right.
I mean, that's the basis of real politics. Henry Kissinger's notion of realism. And go ahead online and check out the recent photos of Clinton and Kissinger. I mean, she's schooled in the real politics school, which is precisely what you're describing. So this is a popular representation of real politics, as if the world is just that way. The world is not constructed that way through our narratives, but it's written into nature itself. Going back to Thomas Hobbes, the world is one of scarcity. It's a war of all against all. Life is nasty, brutish and short. And therefore, here's what becomes justified in the natural world. Of course, the natural world is not that way. These are constructions in which we operate, and Game of Thrones then functions to
and I think
normalize that stuff.
There's like this small line, and I don't remember which episode, where Tyrion sort of references. He says, "Do you sort of think that the average person is concerned with what's going on, up here?"
Right.
Essentially, he says, no, they want to feed their kids. They want, he's like talking about the proletariat, essentially, right? But we don't see it. Like, it's not represented in the show. It's actually not seen.
Yeah.
Like, so you can talk about it. You can like give a couple lines here and there to this vast world where all these other things are really happening, all these other storylines are playing out, but you don't see them marginalized in a real way. I mean, you might see a character here and there, like Grey Worm,
and that functions, right?
Yeah, that functions, and the story plays out, right?
And Grey Worm, as you just implied, is a representative of that, and is literally impotent and castrated. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's presenting an idea on its own.
So and the whole Daenerys thing, like we talked about this earlier. Yeah. She speaks to two people: the impotent soldier and the sex slave type translator, right? And then so that's the interconnection between the actual people on that show.
Yeah.
And as a way to like kind of bring it together, like I'm sort of the opinion that we are. I mean, like as I expressed last week, I'm sort of the opinion that there's not much way out of the structure at this point. I don't believe in it, but here's your way out. It's supposed to be an art. This is where we're supposed to. This is where we're supposed to explore the possibilities of human life, of ethics, and I'm not saying everything has to be optimistic necessarily, but I'm saying at least show me a way in which you're not just parroting what you see in reality and accepting that is just the way things are.
Right. I guess something that's came clear to me, like, so Game of Thrones functions. It's basically a soap opera. It's interfamilial, interpersonal, sexual. All the stuff that comes in soap opera, high drama, familial bullshit, right? And what's happening in particular with fucking Game of Thrones is that you've got. Actually, I'm losing my focus. I don't know if it's the beer or whatever you guys. Yeah.
Well, maybe this is
maybe like a good time to
let's
move it along, right?
Yeah.
So anyway, I was going to segue earlier, but I actually thought we got off on an interesting tangent, so I thought like, fuck it, let's just.
I'll just cut this part out.
Whatever.
From that on.
I think we should keep it.
Right.
So I was going in on this. I was trying to naturally transition us from Game of Thrones into the next topic, and part of what Game of Thrones had reminded me of is something that happened last week, which was in Game of Thrones we had on the episode previous to which we had Hodor die, heroic sacrifice, blah blah blah, whatever. Same episode. Who else of significance dies? The nature girl chick whose name I don't remember.
The wildling.
Yeah, the wildling, right? And who died?
Osha, I think.
Kills herself. And then what's the other big death that actually a lot of people on the internet were pissed off about? The CGI dog, the wolf, or whatever.
Oh, right.
And this brings me, because a lot of people reacted to that way more strongly. Like, what does Game of Thrones have against wolves or whatever?
Right.
And this brings me to our next topic, which was where we wanted to sort of end up, and which was the topic I'm actually the most interested in and the most excited to talk about, which is the gorilla in the zoo. Which I think
What is that gorilla's name?
Fuck the gorilla and his name. Harambe, I think his name is. But I think what I sort of want to get into, and I think we want to address this in a different way than has been addressed in a lot of places. And I think the way it's been addressed has been one of two ways. Either people who are completely uncritical saying, what about the gorilla? God, this is horrible that this happened to this gorilla, blah, 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 with no concept of what could have happened to the child or whatever, right? And then the other way, which was, the zoo did a good job, but, this is still a tragic situation. Without addressing what I found to be the most distasteful part of the whole thing, which was how willing human beings were to throw other human beings under the bus in order to express outrage on behalf of an animal. And I kind of wanted to get into that today because it wasn't to me just an expression of, look, nobody out here is saying that we should be treating animals poorly or we should even just kill them indiscriminately. But it was interesting to me the level of outrage levied, some of which I thought was vaguely racist, against this mother.
Not even like close. It just was explicitly racist.
Yeah, some of it I think was just straight up racist. I think some of it was also just subtly racist, which without it being said.
Right.
And we, as an interesting callback to the last podcast when we got into Anonymous and their impotent revolution, their big topic or issue this week was to call for this mother to be investigated, right, for poor parenting, as if any parent on the planet hasn't ever made a mistake before or looked away from their child momentarily. And to be honest with you, that's not even where I want to go with this, but I wanted to at least get the topic rolling. So let's sort of get where everybody is initially, and then I have something sort of to say about this on a more philosophical level, I guess, or biographical level. But I want to hear what maybe everybody else has to say first.
Let me just hop in because for sometimes when people listen to podcasts, they listen to them years later, and I just want because of the nature of forgetfulness and our degree of forgetfulness in culture, we should probably just say really quickly a little bit of snippet about what happened so that people can be reminded, because this headline will be gone in probably a week. Basically, there was a bunch of people at a zoo, and this mother took her eyes off her child for a while. The child fell into the gorilla exhibit. then there caused a large uproar, and people were watching this child sort of helplessly flailing around, or unconscious, I guess, in this sort of a gorilla exhibit. The gorilla sort of moved to, as some people characterized it, sort of to caretake this child, and but we don't really know exactly what happened.
Right? How can we know?
How can we know? We don't really know. And the zoo ultimately took action and shot this gorilla, restoring order or whatever you call it, saving this child. The internet went in a tizzy afterwards because of that. So I just want to kind of contextualize sort of the story so people can look back to June 2016 and have a sort of benchmark for understanding of what happened.
Sorry for the intervention, but I'm just opening some beers.
As we often do on this podcast.
Professionalism is on
we need
point,
to do it. Yeah.
Well, fuck professionalism. That means integration within the system.
There we go, dude.
And so we have a lot of we had a lot of sort of like back and forth, as happens with sensational sort of politics and storytelling in terms of what happens in the media, and this is just the latest iteration of that. And one of the analyses that I didn't really see but am really interested in is the politics of power and how that plays into this story. So I didn't really see, I'm sure people have, but I didn't see it represented, was this kind of questioning about what is a zoo? Why do we have zoos? Like we sort of imprison these sort of like animals in these small cages and expect them to sort of be handled by
human.
Handlers.
Or be human.
Yeah, or be human.
Be good.
Yeah, be good. And a lot of the blame coming down sort of on the mother for not having watched this child. But what parent has not lost track of their child? Happens all the time. This could happen. This is going to happen in a societal structure in which we have zoos where things are climbable.
And in an environment in Disney where they've watched all these Disney movies and they're like, let me go see Simba over there.
Well, let's save that for a minute.
But just as an aside, an introduction, I know you're going to go deep into that shit.
Yeah, and so I just want to kind of quickly just throw this in there because this is my 2 cents, is that we have a massive systemic problem where we have these structures where we have wild animals, and yet we're blaming essentially the
black mother.
Yeah, we're blaming the black mother, and we're not casting suspicion upon the discourse and structure of zoos, which lends itself to these accidents completely, and then we don't hold that accountable. So why is a zoo structured the way that it is, and what's the responsibility of how do we critique structures of power? Essentially,
right.
Like how do we rethink the way that we view the wild world? And what part does that have in this conversation, rather than an issue of personal responsibility?
Exactly.
Rather than an issue of man versus wild.
Yeah, it's interesting. Tim, did you have anything you wanted to go ahead?
You go first.
Okay, so like I said, I think this was the most interesting topic for me this week. Not because I'm not interested in the other stuff that we had to talk about, but just because this struck home personally for me in a way that recalled some of the stuff I remember from my youth. And to me, gets at the point of this podcast even, which is to say that our initial thesis for coming up with this whole podcast was to analyze how pop culture affects the world we live in and the people themselves. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to posit something about the ethic that we've created, which is to say that I think it's entirely formed by pop culture and by what we've consumed. So let me go back in time a little bit to when I was, a fucking idiot kid, and I was hanging around with my dad. And my dad was a quiet dude, and we didn't really share many interests even when I was younger or whatever. But the one thing that we did like to do, and one of the things that I was always very happy to do with my father, is he would sit around and he watched a lot of TV, but it wasn't, he would watch nature shows. And back in the day, this was stuff like, Discovery Channel or Animal Planet or Nat Geo or whatever. And those shows were not what they are today. So somebody who I think doesn't understand, because they think of what happens on Animal Planet these days, and they see a billion dog rescue reality shows, or they see a bunch of like shows about animal hoarders or whatever. And that's not what those channels used to be. And I remember when my dad was watching this back in the day, you would throw on the Discovery Channel, and if it was, lions of the African savannah, you knew you were going to get a pretty dire, or at least realistic,
or graphic,
and often incredibly graphic depiction of nature, right? You were going to get, here's the lions, here's the pride, here's them assaulting and mobbing a wildebeest for food and slowly suffocating it over the course of 3 hours because a lion lacks the ability to quickly kill an animal, right? And I remember watching this from a very young age and being exposed to something different from what you saw in the rest of the media. Because at the same time as I was young, I was also being brought up, when my parents weren't around, you'd throw on a fucking Disney movie or whatever.
Yeah.
And what happens in a lot of Disney movies? You have these anthropomorphized animals, which are essentially people, but we've decided that they're more palatable or cuter or whatever if we make it into a fox, or if we tell the story from the perspective of an animal or whatever. And those characters are working in a place where they have a moral or ethic which mirrors our own, a human one, right? And I think part of what's happened with the society, and I don't know if I'm willing to lay the entire blame on it, is when you see the constant outrage over any time this happens. Remember a few years ago when that dude killed that giant boar in Florida, and there was the other time when the guy killed like the dentist or whatever, killed like I forgot, it was a rhino or something in Africa, and there was like month-long outrage about this stuff.
Yeah.
And I read in the paper yesterday a great article by the New York Times talking about how like over Memorial Day weekend there were like 65 people killed in Chicago, right? And nobody gives a shit.
Right.
But we've chosen to go ahead and value the animal over this. And I saw one interesting comment. I forgot what article I saw it on. And I often feel like sometimes the comments are more interesting and more of a window into people's psyche than the actual article. And somebody had commented in an article that was about this subject. And they said, well, the reason that we care more is because the animal is innocent, right? In a way that the human is not. Animals are not innocent. Okay? These are things that...
Well, in a Nietzsche level, they're beyond good and evil.
Right.
Those are just human categorizations.
Right.
Yes.
The idea of morals or ethics, I would posit, is entirely a construction, not just of people, but of people and their societies, right?
Yeah.
The things
And
that we
morally
built.
relative, right?
And I'm fine with that. I think that that's okay. I think the one few good things that we've produced by creating this huge structure of society that we call, one of the few good things that we've produced is the increasing lack of acceptance for violence, rape, whatever. These things all exist in the animal sphere, and the animal sphere doesn't understand that, doesn't have an ethic, doesn't have a moral sense, right?
Survival.
It's
Not in a
survival.
classically human idea, like our linguistic sort of constructs or social.
Exactly. So my question is, with that being an understanding, why are we not at this point willing to acknowledge that the human species, because we are a part of the human species and we are ourselves creating the entire concept of animal rights, why do we not value the human more than the animal? And that's sort of where I'm arriving at things. So that was my thought.
I think that reminds me of a lot of like Werner Herzog's films, which we all have watched together, and we kind of talk about Werner Herzog's kind of whole project. Like I'm thinking in particular of Grizzly Man,
Yes.
What was that film when he was in the
Arctic?
In the Arctic,
Yeah.
Penguin going out into the
yeah.
woods.
Has a penguin ever gone insane? And I think there's something to this liberal sentimentality, which basically asserts that. I'm thinking in terms of ideology here. I'm such a good person. I'm so kind. I'm so loving that my empathy extends to the animal kingdom. There are some unquestioned assumptions in that. One is that it's so covered in the human realm that you can now let your cup overflow and now start extending your benevolent liberalism to the animal kingdom as kind of like some biblical keeper of the species. I forget what the actual biblical language is, but you're like the shepherd of animals and all this stuff, right? What this begs a question for me, which is simply, but what is the political arrangement of kind of dominant neoliberalism? What we live in is a society in which there's rampant poverty. There's imperial wars happening, launched from the United States that are brutal. Like, for instance, thinking in terms of the Iraq War, we prior to invasion, 1.2 million children were killed as an effect of sanctions, blocking medicines and medical technologies, which were no longer allowed in because they had weapons of mass destruction, and therefore they couldn't have weapons of mass destruction until we put all these sanctions on them, economic sanctions, which led to the death of 1.2 million children. So simultaneously, we have this drive to you have a child in the zoo incident. On the one side, you've got, kill the gorilla to protect the child, but then also our benevolence is that we're already so kind of benevolent that, of course, killing children is expected, or, excuse me, protecting children is expected. So now we can extend this benevolence to protecting the animals and all this. And the way that I see this functioning ideologically is to say we are such good people. We're such good people. Our awareness, our consciousness, our humanitarianism is extended so far that that we can think in terms of protecting this gorilla. That ideological space functions to mask our actual relation of the world, which is what the liberal is a war criminal. Effectively, the liberal is the Clinton-esque liberal is someone who has supported crimes against humanity, rampant stratification of wealth or whatever, and then if you can then say, oh, but I'm into animal rights. Those things contradict one another. There's a cognitive. I could never be a bad person that would support colonial wars. I care about people and life, and I'm so moral that I don't even want gorillas to get hurt, let alone human beings. And what that does then is one feels about themselves that they're this morally superior person. So this animal rights activist feels more morally superior, but simultaneously, through lack of engagement with the reality of the world, allows for crimes against human beings to be, to be affected, to be, and all the while feeling morally superior. And so this whole gorilla incident is almost an exercise in moral self-righteousness, in the construction of an identity linked to a particular politics, which accepts as normal and status quo really horrendous violence and oppression and all these other things. You can disappear that stuff doesn't come into consciousness, because how could it possibly, if I care about gorillas? How could I possibly be a bad person? I care about gorillas. When in reality, what you do is, what were you doing in 2001, 2002? Were you anti the invasion of Iraq, or were you for it? Because that's your responsibility. There are forces working against you in the media and in politics to keep you uninformed.
Yeah, absolutely.
But if you care so much about a fucking guerrilla, why don't you fucking actually care to find out the truth about why the fuck we're invading Iraq? And if you care about the guerrilla, you never have to do that work. Because by definition, you are a good person. And therefore, this whole argument... So it's an insane argument to me. The idea that our government can be responsible for, war crimes on the scale that is really unimaginable without our level of technological development, the most powerful imperial force in the history of the world, going ahead and just wrecking shop all over the world, colonial wars, invading Arabic Muslim countries, decimating our own hemisphere, all these particular problems that we're all deeply engaged with, and as a kind of a liberal, you are part and parcel of, as opposed to a more radical position, right? But then simultaneously, using this ideologically to escape one's own responsibility, to look oneself in the mirror and say, I am personally, in a democratic society, responsible for the annihilation of children. I am personally responsible for war crimes because of my support, right? Impossible. Impossible because I went on Facebook and argued that it was a bad idea that guerrilla got shot. How does that function psychologically? It's a defense against one coming to an awareness about their current political positionality, right?
And I think you point to a really this is the piece that I want to kind of clarify within the argument that you're making, which I find really interesting. Is there's a sort of equation between the knowledge that one has as a citizen, of the larger political structure and the violence that it enacts upon the world, right? And you pointed a little bit, you sort of hinted at this idea that folks don't, like, you're protected from having sequestered away from the information. Like, not everybody has all the information,
right?
As somebody who, I know you read Chomsky like quite a bit, and you're really informed on these things, and it's something that you have to actively seek out,
right? And there are certain things you're given,
right?
Like the guerrilla story,
right? That's what you're given.
That's what you're given, so you can go ahead and feel like a
moral outrage.
You can feel like a good person. You cannot feel like a good person on the issues that actually matter.
But my point is, how does one, when the information you work, say, a lot of us work like 9 to 5, we work a lot of long hours, we have a few seconds to check Facebook, some things ignite, the information that you're given about the world, right, is not that 1.2 million children died, but that this guerrilla died. So how what's the connection between sort of seeking out the information, like what's one's responsibility in trying to get to, I'm struggling at this, but how does one get the information to become responsible, to recognize how that cycle works, right? So that when you see something about a guerrilla dying, you actually think critically about
how is this being used politically?
Right. What does this indicate towards the knowledge that I don't have about human beings dying? 1.2 million.
Yeah, right.
That's that's a sixth of the people that died under Stalin's regime.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So it's like how, I guess the problem for me is sort of like, how do we come to be a better informed society so that the smoke and mirrors don't sort of like obfuscate the evil that's happening in one realm, which we're not given access to readily, but we're given easy access to all these sort of smaller sort of instances of a gorilla or a rhinoceros. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah,
what I'm
yeah.
kind of getting at?
Yeah, I do. And I think there's no simple answer to that. I think that what it is if you become aware of something, then you must necessarily, as an individual, then explore that. Like, we all have our 9 to 5 jobs. Look, there's alternative media sources one can explore. But there's, when you hear something like what I'm saying, you can't then say, engage with that, then say, okay, forget it. and then continue on. If you're moved morally, a sense of moral outrage by that, then one as an individual must make the effort to escape kind of the dominant ideological framework. And then once you make that move, there are other people, there are other avenues of information, right, that one can explore. But I think at the first step, this is the deal: one must give a shit. And people can act like they give a shit all the time about, because they express outrage about a gorilla. But then, there's a certain degree of allowing oneself to be manipulated, to be, which requires a real act of resistance. That's really what resistance is. Yeah. At least that's how I think about it. Jesse, you had something to say.
I was going to come at the idea of if you are exposed to something that you suddenly realize is objectionable, right? And we all have these 9 to 5s, we only have a certain amount of time or whatever. I feel like the internet is progressively making this more and more suspect of an argument, right? I can get on during my conference period at work and look something up on my phone in 5 minutes and get to the real truth of what's happening. There's almost, I feel like it's getting to the point where there's almost no excuse for not knowing. We don't have to wait for the newspaper in the morning. We don't have to seek out, a journal or whatever to get what we need. We have a free space where everything is published and where a discerning, intelligent person can siphon their way through the bullshit and get to what exists in an incredibly quick amount of time. And if you've just decided, you know what, my act today is to go on this gorilla article and post my fucking moral indignance about this, then you have made a decision which to me is ethically lazy, and which is essentially that you're indicating I am not willing to care about the more substantive things happening. And to go back to even a political point, we have a country we live in a country that is essentially going through what I would consider the death throes of maybe not necessarily the Republican Party, but the death throes of the power of the white male over the democratic structure, which to me is almost actually in a way optimistic, which is to say that we have a candidate who the only demographic he's winning is that, right? That's all that's happening. Why are we not more invested in that? And you've decided, and a number of people have decided that their big problem is going to be the treatment of this gorilla. And to go all the way back to something you said earlier, which was what is the place of a zoo or whatever. And I'm going to be perfectly frank and say that, look, I go to the zoo. You know what I mean? I attend there. And I think it raises interesting ethical let's assume that what I'm saying is correct, which is to say that I'm a believer that we shouldn't treat animals poorly. I don't think we should indiscriminately hurt animals or harm animals. I think we should treat them nicely. I'm not altogether convinced that a zoo is the worst place in the world. I think nature is fundamentally an awful place to exist in. And like I said, I grew up watching a ton of animal shows, and I grew up watching a ton of what exists in nature. And when it was represented correctly, and Werner Herzog, for example, when it's represented the way that it really is, then you get a sense for how terrifying and potentially violent this sphere is, and you recognize that what we've been able to create as far as animal rights are inherently a human construction. That is not a thing. Animal rights are not a thing.
Human rights aren't.
Human rights aren't even a thing. This is a creation of the society, and as such, animal rights are a creation.
And there's not a problem with that either.
Yeah, and that's fine.
That's good.
That's okay.
That's a mark of civilization, rationality, right? But the problem is then when you then further push some ideology on top of the existence of these zoos, or on top of that these things are somehow human, right? Or then you totally miss the brutality of, like, fine, have a zoo. Let's recognize the reality of what animals are, where they come from,
right,
and kind of what the state of wild nature is, which can be excessively brutal. It can
right.
be. There is no morality in nature.
Right.
Right. And so I think that all this stuff, like from a Nietzschean level, is about some kind of decadence in thinking, some kind of collapse in thinking, moving towards kind of like what's easy. What's really easy is to think that the lions in the zoo are like Lion King. Right. Because then one never has to recognize the reality of what nature actually is.
Well, I'm going to posit something, which is to say, go to the zoo, go to your lion exhibit, whatever, catch the male lion, see him sleeping in his enclosure, and be pissed off that he must be depressed or emotionally anxious, that he's cooped up in this space, right? And ignore the possibility that actually male lions in the wild sleep like 23 and a half hours a day and don't do much.
Yeah.
Right? And also ascribe emotional context to things that I'm not necessarily certain have an emotional ability to express anything of what you're talking about. So that's kind of what my problem is here, is that nobody's saying mistreat animals or do harm upon animals or treat them shitty. I don't think people that even work in a zoo are looking to do that, right? I think that the problem is necessarily that we have chosen to elevate an idea that doesn't exist to such a level of importance that we ignore what I think should be the more critical concern, which is the concern for humans. And I'm not talking about human rights. Well, actually, I am talking about human rights, but the ones that we created. And the society has created these things, and we're building these things for a reason, so that we can live a better way. But we need to work on that, and we need to worry about that, and we need to devote more of our intellectual space to that, rather than, diverting our attention to things that are kind of a solved issue.
Right. And to be clear, what I'm talking about is a Marxist analysis, and I'm combining psychological analysis and political analysis, right? And so in the way that psychology informs a particular politics, what I'm asking in a blunt nutshell is about the person that supports Donald Trump and expresses moral outrage about a gorilla getting shot. These people exist. Jesse, we were just having a conversation yesterday with someone who basically supports Trump, but I guarantee was outraged at the shooting of this fucking gorilla.
How do the two coexist?
Right? And how do these two coexist? Because I'm the type of person that expresses outrage. I'm such a decent person, right? But then I'll support policies which are, I'm just wondering, how fucking stupid are people? How stupid are we as a species? You're supporting somebody that doesn't fucking believe in climate change, that literally in 2 generations will lead to like maybe the elimination of the species, to go back to something Chomsky was talking about, right? You've got somebody that's brutal to other fucking people, right? And so you've got all these justifications, these psychological defense mechanisms against recognizing this reality, one of which is, I'm not a racist, I'm not a bad person, I don't support imperial policies. Basically, I'm not a Nazi. You know how I'm not a Nazi? It's because I have real tenderness and care for animals. That's how that functions. And if that becomes your primary political analysis, like if you're an animal rights activist and you see that, you're missing. There's so much going on you're just entirely unaware of, because there's no way that can be your primary political focus if you have any sense of the chaos that the world is in. The world, I'm talking about issues of war and peace, I'm talking about issues of poverty, I'm talking about issues of economics, basically under the fundamental assumption that as a human being, your first concern is other human beings. If that is your concern, then the amount of outrage, all that stuff is ideology. All that stuff functions politically to mask what's really going on in the world and to make you feel that you're a decent person. And so you can coexist with the most ugliest, horrific bullshit policies and simultaneously feel like you're some great person, right?
Yeah.
And so that's what I see when I see this article, this Harambe guerrilla shooting.
That was the name, right?
I'm going to jump in and just pick up on something you said, Jesse, real quick, which was that we assign these sort of like, sort of anthropomorphize animals, and we sort of assign these sort of human emotions to them, right?
Right.
And I want to point to this fantastic David Foster Wallace article called "Consider the Lobster,"
yeah.
I've read this,
in which he basically points to this very thing. And he has this really interesting insight in which he wants us to move linguistically from assigning emotion to assigning this idea of preference. He says clearly this lobster, when it's like thrown into this like 160 degree water, whatever it is screaming. It's
yeah, that shit sucks.
But he says it's not. He says it's not trying to communicate some emotion as much as it's trying to communicate a preference. And so if we couch our ideas about, if we move to this more sort of like subtle view of what animals are trying to indicate, then it might lead us to a less human sort of projection of what we think is going on.
Right.
And a more sort of like indicating towards something, a trust and an indication towards something, right? And then the last sort of point that I want to make is sort of like, I'm going to challenge Werner Herzog here and now, who's one of my most respected people in the world, to release the audio from Grizzly Man in which the man is violently murdered, and he asks the wife, who's maybe dead now, to never listen to it again. And if you want to hear,
Never listen to it at all. She's
never listen to it at all.
Yeah.
So release that audio and let's see what that's like to listen to a human being mauled devastatingly by a grizzly bear.
But maybe that will change one's perspective about
and
Harambe
maybe
the
then,
gorilla.
and maybe then we won't think that teddy bears are Winnie the fucking Pooh or whatever.
Yeah. Right.
Maybe you'll realize what that actually is.
Yeah.
So, gentlemen, I want to thank you today for our conversation. Are we good to wrap it up there? Does anybody have any final thoughts?
I think we're good.
That's it. Game of Thrones is on later tonight. We'll be back to shit on it next week.
We'll be back in a couple of weeks with our next installation.
Right.
Arya Stark and Mad Men and Werner Herzog. We'll see if he releases that audio.
Awesome. Thanks, Gabe.